A day of celebration. The loud bang of the door slamming open reverberated through the room, the unexpected intrusion slicing through the once harmonious atmosphere. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The excited chatter that had filled the auditorium with warmth and pride quickly turned into tense murmurs of confusion. Eyes darted from one another, searching for answers, trying to understand what was happening. The shift from jubilation to uncertainty was palpable. Marcus could feel the change in the air immediately. The temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. His pulse quickened as he instinctively placed his hand over his chest. There was something wrong. The man who had entered was not there to join the celebration, his presence was an intrusion. The officer's boots rang like a hammer against the polished floor, each step louder than the last. His stride was commanding, but not welcoming. His eyes were dark and cold, scanning the crowd with an intensity that made every individual feel as though they were under scrutiny. Marcus' gaze followed the officer's path, narrowing as the man moved purposefully toward the stage. Something was off, something that struck him immediately. The officer's eyes locked onto Amara. He wasn't looking at her as a student, as a child, or even as a person. It felt as though he saw nothing more than a target, a pawn. The way his gaze fixed on her, full of contempt, made Marcus' chest tighten. His mind spun with questions, none of them making sense. Why her? What did she do? Before Marcus could gather his thoughts, the officer's voice shattered the silence. His words were sharp and deliberate, carrying a tone of authority that left no room for defiance. "Step down now," the officer commanded. His voice was like a blade cutting through the calm. The words were an assault in themselves. The tone was not one of request, but of demand. Amara, whose nerves were already on edge from the magnitude of the speech she was about to deliver, flinched. The microphone was in her hand, but she didn't know whether to lower it or keep it raised. She looked out into the sea of faces, her mind racing, trying to process what was happening. "Excuse me?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, the words coming out slower than she intended. She wanted to defend herself, to ask what was happening, but the officer's glare was enough to stop her in her tracks. "I said, step down." The officer's voice was colder now, filled with irritation. He pointed directly at her, singling her out with a gesture that felt like a weapon. "You matched the description of someone causing trouble. Hands up and step down now." The room's energy shifted again, this time to confusion, followed by disbelief. Marcus watched as Amara froze at the podium. Her face paled, and he could see her struggle to make sense of the officer's words. The once vibrant glow she had carried as she prepared to speak was now clouded by the fear of the unknown. She stood there, paralyzed, unsure how to react. But Marcus knew exactly how he had to react. In a split second, his instincts kicked in. The situation felt wrong on every level. His heart raced as the father inside him surged to the forefront of his mind. He saw his daughter, vulnerable and confused, and he couldn't let this go unchecked. "Hey," he called out, his voice loud and urgent. He was already moving toward the stage before he realized it. The crowd shifted and murmured in response, turning to face him as he made his way forward. "What do you mean, match the description? She's just a kid." He was close now, almost on the stage, and his anger was beginning to rise. The officer turned slightly, his gaze now directed at Marcus, who had moved to intercept him. There was a moment's hesitation in the officer's eyes, but it quickly turned to disdain. The officer didn't take a step back. He didn't seem to care that Marcus, a father, was standing up for his daughter. In fact, the officer's face hardened, as though he expected Marcus to challenge him. "You people always play the victim, don't you?" the officer sneered, his voice low and venomous. "Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson about accountability." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. It wasn't just an insult against Amara, it was a direct attack on everything he had spent his life standing for. He had fought for justice and fairness, not just as an FBI agent, but as a father and a man of principle. And now, in front of him, the officer was reinforcing every stereotype, every assumption that had held black families back for generations. Marcus' body tensed, his fists clenched at his sides. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. He knew this could escalate quickly. He knew all too well what could happen if he reacted impulsively, but his heart was a battleground between anger and caution. He wanted to charge at the officer, to demand that he let his daughter go, but he knew better. He was no stranger to the fragile line between justice and brutality. The officer ignored Marcus completely, his attention solely on Amara. He moved toward her, his hand going for his gun holster in a menacing gesture. The sudden motion sent a chill through Marcus' spine, but before he could take another step forward, the officer was already climbing the stairs to the stage, his boots slamming against the wooden steps. "No," Marcus muttered under his breath. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything he feared. "Dad, please." Amara's voice was broken, her plea for help echoing in the silence of the room. She wasn't just asking for his protection, she was pleading for him to stop this madness before it got worse. Marcus' heart shattered at the sound of his daughter's voice, tinged with panic. He could see her trembling, trying to maintain her composure, but the fear was written all over her face. The officer reached out and grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her toward him with an almost casual disregard for her discomfort. "Stop. Let her go," Marcus shouted, now sprinting toward the stage. His legs burned with the urgency of the moment, the blood pumping in his ears. "What are you doing? She's just a kid." But the officer didn't even acknowledge Marcus' words. His grip tightened on Amara's arm, and she stumbled as he pulled her down the steps, her face flushed with embarrassment and terror. "I didn't do anything wrong," Amara cried, her voice a raw mixture of confusion and desperation. Her feet tripped over the bottom step, causing her to stumble and almost fall. But the officer didn't show any mercy, forcing her forward with every step. The humiliation was overwhelming, her body shaking as she tried to regain her balance. Marcus moved forward, but before he could reach the bottom of the stairs, the officer spun around, positioning himself between Marcus and Amara. His hand rested firmly on his gun holster, a clear threat. "Back off, sir," the officer spat, his words sharp and deliberate. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The audience was silent, but Marcus could feel the weight of their collective gaze. They were all watching. Some were unsure how to react, others were frozen with fear. A few dared to whisper among themselves, but no one moved. They were witnesses to something they had no idea how to stop. The officer dragged Amara toward the door with no remorse. Her cries were drowned out by the officer's dismissive grunts, and the silence that followed felt like 1,000 pounds pressing on Marcus' chest. His heart was racing, but it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. He wanted to do something, anything, but he knew that one wrong move could escalate this into something far more dangerous. As the officer passed through the doorway with Amara in tow, Marcus stood there, paralyzed. His eyes never left his daughter, even as she was pulled out of the auditorium like a criminal. "Let her go," he shouted one last time, but his voice was swallowed by the doors that slammed shut behind them. The room was still. The buzz of excitement had been replaced by a deep, haunting silence. No one spoke. Marcus could hear the thud of his own heartbeat, the echo of what had just occurred ringing in his ears. His body trembled with the adrenaline of the moment, but it wasn't just the fear of what might happen next, it was the crushing reality of injustice, the kind that had been with him his whole life, but never so personally. As the door slammed behind him, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come, the storm unleashed. The tension in the auditorium was unbearable. Every eye was on Marcus, but his mind wasn't there. He could barely feel the cold air seeping through his clothes as he stood motionless, his hands still clenched in fists by his side. The words the officer had thrown at him earlier echoed in his mind, haunting him with each passing second. You people always play the victim, maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson about accountability. Marcus' jaw tightened. His pulse was still racing as the adrenaline from the confrontation coursed through his veins. But the heat of anger slowly gave way to a cold, calculated rage, a feeling he had spent his entire career fighting to suppress. This wasn't just about his daughter, it was about the system that had failed so many others like her. It was about years of structural oppression, a life spent confronting injustice in the courtroom, but never having to face it this directly. And now, in front of the one person he cared about more than anything in the world, that injustice had taken shape, had become flesh and bone. The officer's words were a slap in the face of everything Marcus had worked for. Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson about accountability. The officer wasn't just an isolated case of a rogue cop, he was a representation of something much larger, something much more insidious. It was a reminder of the systemic forces that had always been there, lurking in the background, ready to rear their ugly head when least expected. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle over him. He could still hear Amara's cries, still see the terror in her eyes as she was dragged out of the auditorium like a criminal. The words of his colleagues, his friends, his mentors echoed in his ears. Stay calm. Don't let them provoke you. Think before you act. But this was different. This wasn't a case. This wasn't someone else's child. This was his daughter. His flesh and blood. And no set of instructions or code of conduct could prepare him for the ache of watching her suffer like that. His fingers twitched as the impulse to move forward, to run out after her, almost overwhelmed him. But he knew better. He couldn't afford to act recklessly. Not when things were this volatile. The room was silent, save for the soft shuffle of shoes and the hushed whispers that rippled through the crowd. People were scared, he could feel it in the air. It wasn't just fear for themselves, though. They feared what might happen next. Would the officer return? Would things escalate further? Would they become part of the story in ways they couldn't yet comprehend? It didn't take long for a few teachers to step forward, their expressions full of concern and confusion, their voices tentative as they approached Marcus. What just happened? What is going on? Why would he do that? One of the teachers asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though afraid even to speak too loudly in case the officer was still lurking nearby. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know, Marcus replied, his voice strained, barely masking the fury that simmered just beneath the surface. He took a deep breath, trying to regain some semblance of control. But that man, he just took my daughter for no reason. He had no right. I don't understand. I've never seen anything like this before, the teacher said, her voice full of sympathy. Marcus could hear the genuine concern, but he could also feel the weight of something else in her words, uncertainty. She was trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of it in the context of what she had always known to be right. But this wasn't a normal situation, and there was no easy explanation for the terror that had just unfolded. You don't understand, Marcus said, his voice suddenly quieter but filled with conviction. This is what it looks like when justice is denied. When the system is rigged against you. When a child is singled out because of the color of her skin, and there's no reason, no evidence, no cause. He turned his gaze back to the door through which Amara had been dragged. His stomach churned. That's what this is. The other teachers exchanged uncomfortable glances, and Marcus knew they were trying to wrap their minds around what he had just said. They didn't want to believe it. They didn't want to think that something like this could happen in their own community. They were teachers, after all. They believed in fairness. They believed in right and wrong. But Marcus had been fighting for justice long enough to know how quickly things could go wrong, how easily power could be abused, how quickly the truth could be buried. I'm going to go after her, he said, determination flooding his voice. He could no longer stand still. He couldn't let this go unanswered. He couldn't let his daughter, his sweet, innocent daughter, be treated like a criminal. I have to make sure she's okay. Before anyone could stop him, Marcus turned and pushed through the door, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. The sunlight hit him like a slap, the brightness almost blinding after the dark intensity of what had just happened inside the auditorium. The parking lot was sparsely populated, a few cars scattered here and there, but there was no sign of the officer or his daughter. Marcus' chest tightened as he jogged toward the nearest squad car. His breath came in sharp bursts as panic began to seep in. What if he was too late? What if they had already taken her somewhere else? What if she was alone and scared? He reached the car, his heart hammering in his chest, but it was empty. No officer in sight. No sign of Amara. The sound of distant sirens echoed in the background, growing louder with each passing second. The tension in Marcus' chest deepened as he whipped around, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Where was she? Where had they taken her? And then he saw it. A black SUV, parked just a few spaces away. The windows were tinted, but the police markings on the side were unmistakable. His gut clenched. He could feel the knot in his stomach grow tighter with each passing second. This was it. This was where they had taken her. He didn't hesitate. His feet moved faster now, his breath coming in short bursts as he ran toward the vehicle. But as he got closer, something made him stop, something that made his stomach twist with dread. The officer was standing by the SUV. He was speaking with another officer, one who looked almost as rigid as the first, and both of them were carrying an air of self-importance. But it was the way the first officer was holding himself that sent a chill down Marcus' spine. There was something about the officer's demeanor, the way he stood there with his back straight, his arms crossed as though he was in control of the situation, that told Marcus everything he needed to know. This wasn't a simple case of misunderstanding anymore. This was bigger than that. This wasn't just a corrupt cop in a small town. This was a man who believed in his power to do whatever he wanted, and now he had a daughter, his daughter, locked away, at the mercy of a system that was more willing to protect him than her. Marcus took one more deep breath, steeling himself. He could feel the storm inside him beginning to swell. He wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. Not while his daughter was out there, waiting for him. The reckoning. The air felt thick with the heat of Marcus' anger. His eyes locked onto the black SUV, his thoughts racing, every possibility flooding his mind. The cold grip of helplessness was beginning to melt away, replaced by a fierce determination. He had fought for justice in the courtroom for years, but now he was standing outside, facing the brutal reality that sometimes, justice wasn't just a matter of law, it was a matter of survival. His footsteps echoed through the empty parking lot as he approached the squad car. He could see the officers now, one of them leaning against the vehicle, speaking to the other officer in what seemed like a casual conversation, as if they were discussing the weather rather than holding a young girl in the back of their patrol car. His breath came out in sharp, controlled bursts as he approached them. "Excuse me," Marcus called, his voice carrying with authority. The officers looked up, their faces unreadable, but Marcus didn't miss the slight tightening of their jaws, the way they straightened in unison as they saw him approach. It was a subtle shift, but one that did not go unnoticed by Marcus. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice steady but full of the raw emotion he had been bottling up since Amara was taken. He was no longer the calm, collected attorney, he was a father, filled with fear and fury. "Where is my daughter?" The officer who had initially grabbed Amara gave Marcus a hard look, his stance defensive but not quite aggressive. He didn't immediately respond. Instead, he turned to his partner, who stood with his arms crossed, watching Marcus like a hawk. "I said, where is she?" Marcus repeated, stepping forward, but the officer raised his hand in a gesture that was half dismissive, half threatening. "She's being processed," the officer said curtly, his tone cold. "Processed?" Marcus echoed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "What exactly are you processing?" "She's a student," an honor student. She was about to give a speech when you interrupted her, dragged her off stage, and humiliated her in front of her peers. She has done nothing wrong, and you have no right to treat her this way. The officer's eyes narrowed, and Marcus could see the subtle flicker of irritation behind his gaze. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this. He was the one with power, the one with authority, and Marcus wasn't supposed to be questioning him. "You don't get to talk to me like that," the officer said slowly, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Marcus' blood boiled at the officer's condescending tone. The nerve. The gall to talk down to him like this. Marcus had spent years fighting against this kind of behavior, this abuse of power, and yet here he was, face to face with it again, only this time, it was more personal. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Marcus shot back, his voice rising. "I'm dealing with a corrupt, power-hungry officer who thinks that his badge gives him the right to treat my daughter like a criminal. You don't get to do that, not to her, not to anyone. You'll release her now, or I'll make sure this ends in a way you won't forget." For a moment, there was silence. The officer's partner gave a sharp look to the officer who had detained Amara, as though weighing their options. The tension was palpable. Marcus felt like the entire world had narrowed down to just the three of them in this parking lot, and for the first time in a long while, it felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice. The officer in charge stepped forward, his posture suddenly much more threatening. He glared down at Marcus, his hand still resting on the holstered gun at his side. "You better watch your tone, pal," he spat, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're lucky I'm being patient with you." Marcus stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. His body felt taut with the need to act, but he knew that one wrong move could escalate things in ways that wouldn't just affect him, it would affect Amara. He wasn't going to let her suffer any more than she already had. "Take me to her," Marcus said, his voice flat and resolute. The officer hesitated, eyeing Marcus with suspicion, but finally, he jerked his head toward the black SUV. "You want to see your precious daughter?" he said, his voice bitter, as though Marcus were asking for a favor rather than his legal right. "Fine. Get in." Marcus didn't waste another second. He walked toward the SUV with purpose, his heart thudding in his chest, his every step a reminder of what was at stake. The officer followed closely behind, a few paces back, as if he expected Marcus to make a run for it. But Marcus wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was confronting this, he was taking back control. The SUV's back door was open, and Marcus could see Amara sitting inside, her hands cuffed in front of her, her head bent low. Her long braids fell in front of her face, obscuring her expression. Marcus felt a pang in his chest at the sight. His daughter, his brave, brilliant, resilient daughter, had been reduced to this, a frightened girl, confined in the back of a police vehicle, in the hands of a man who had no right to do this to her. He couldn't let this stand. Not for her. Not for anyone. As he reached the vehicle, the officer who had been speaking to him earlier opened the door, stepping aside to allow Marcus to approach. "She's been detained," the officer said, his voice full of the kind of bureaucratic detachment that made Marcus' skin crawl. "She'll be processed, and then she'll be free to go. But that doesn't mean she gets to go scot-free. This isn't a small matter." Marcus turned his gaze to Amara, ignoring the officer's words. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face, her wide eyes filled with fear. The sight of his daughter so vulnerable, so helpless, made his blood boil with rage. "Amara," Marcus said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, but she heard him. Her head shot up at the sound of his voice, and for the first time, a small flicker of recognition crossed her face. She wiped her eyes hastily, trying to compose herself. "Dad. I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, baby," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet, simmering fury. He reached out to touch her hand through the bars of the vehicle, but the officer quickly stepped in between them, blocking his movement. "She's under arrest," the officer snapped, his tone stern. "She's not going anywhere until we sort this out." "Not until you release her," Marcus said, his voice firm with authority. He wasn't backing down now. Not when it mattered the most. "She's done nothing wrong, and you know it. You have no right to hold her. You release her now." The officer gave him a hard look, but Marcus could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The strength that had once radiated from the officer's posture was faltering, just slightly, as if a crack had appeared in the facade of authority he had so carefully cultivated. "Let her go," Marcus demanded, his voice hard as steel. There was a moment of silence, heavy, thick with tension, before the officer finally exhaled in frustration. "Fine," he muttered. "But don't think this is over." Marcus didn't need to hear another word. He turned back to Amara, his heart swelling with relief. She was going to be okay. For now. But Marcus knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning. The reckoning had only just begun. The fall of the shield. The scene outside the police station was chaotic. News vans, reporters with microphones, and camera crews gathered in front of the building. It seemed like everyone was waiting for something to break, something big. The air was electric with anticipation, buzzing with whispers and rumors. The officers who had detained Amara were already in their squad cars, trying to blend in with the chaos, but Marcus could feel it, the eyes of the world on them. It wasn't just a fight for justice anymore, it had become a symbol. A battle for dignity, for power, and for the very soul of the community. As Marcus led Amara toward their car, his mind was racing. The officer who had held his daughter was just one part of a system, one cog in a machine that had failed them, had failed so many others before. But that machine could be dismantled. It would be. He had the knowledge, the experience, and the will to make it happen. He couldn't just walk away from this, not when it was bigger than one incident, bigger than one officer. "Dad, I'm sorry," Amara whispered as she slipped into the passenger seat, her voice still raw from the trauma she had experienced. Her hands trembled slightly as she buckled her seatbelt. She had always been a bright, confident young woman, always so full of hope and ambition. But now, there was a shadow in her eyes, a wariness that had never been there before. "No, don't apologize," Marcus said firmly, his voice softened by concern. "You did nothing wrong. This wasn't your fault. You hear me?" "I didn't understand," she began, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "I didn't understand what was happening, Dad. It happened so fast. 1 minute, I'm about to give my speech, and the next. I don't even know. I don't understand why this happened." "I know, baby," Marcus said, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he spoke. "You shouldn't have had to experience any of that. But we're going to make sure it never happens again. I'll make sure of that." The words felt hollow to him, and he could see the doubt in Amara's eyes. It wasn't enough to say it would be okay, it wasn't enough to promise things would change. He had fought the system for years, but the reality of it had always felt more abstract, more distant. But now, it was personal. This was his daughter. And the anger was burning inside him, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished until there was justice. As they drove, Marcus' thoughts were clouded with plans and strategy. He had to take action. He had to go public, but he also needed to ensure that this wasn't swept under the rug by the system that protected officers like the one who had humiliated Amara. This wouldn't be just another case filed away. "We need to speak out," he said after a long silence, his voice resolute. "It's the only way this changes. We have to make it public, Amara. We'll go to the media. We'll make sure everyone knows what happened." Amara looked out the window, the world passing by in a blur. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "Won't it make things worse? I'm just one person. One mistake. One officer. Does it really matter if we make a big deal out of it? Her words stung more than he cared to admit. The doubt in her voice was a reflection of the reality they both knew too well, the fear of standing out, of making waves, of being seen as a target. But Marcus wasn't going to back down. Not when it meant everything. Amara, this isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that is broken, a system that's been failing people like you and me for far too long, Marcus said, his voice steady. It's bigger than us. And you, my daughter, you're not just one person. You're a voice for everyone who's been silenced. This is the chance to change things. She turned to face him, her eyes wide. She had always been intelligent, perceptive, and compassionate. But this was a moment of clarity, a moment when she began to understand what was at stake. You're right, she whispered. It's bigger than us. Marcus drove with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just getting Amara home and safe. He was preparing for the battle ahead. A battle that would shake the very foundation of the injustice they had been forced to endure. The next few days were a blur of interviews, press conferences, and legal consultations. The news had already started to circulate, and the footage of Amara being dragged out of the auditorium, handcuffed and humiliated, had gone viral. Social media exploded with outrage, hashtags calling for accountability for the officer and the department echoed in every corner of the internet. The public was up in arms, and for the first time in a long time, the narrative wasn't in favor of the officers involved. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't going to be easy. The system had a way of protecting its own, and those who went up against it often found themselves isolated, attacked, and exhausted. Amara had been offered therapy, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. She was still processing what had happened, and the constant media attention wasn't helping. Marcus gave her space when she needed it, but he didn't allow her to pull away completely. He understood that silence, when it came to something like this, was complicity. Dad, the officer, he's just doing his job, right? Amara asked one night, her voice quiet as she sat on the couch beside him, staring at the television that was playing footage from the incident. Marcus looked over at her, sensing the vulnerability in her voice. No, sweetheart, he said, shaking his head. He's not just doing his job. He's using his badge to abuse power. He wasn't just doing his job, he was choosing to break the law. He chose to target you, to humiliate you, and that's not something anyone should ever be allowed to get away with. I know, she whispered. How do we fight back, Dad? What if they make it worse? What if they come after us for this? The weight of her fear was palpable, and Marcus felt the burden of responsibility heavier than ever. I won't let them hurt you, Marcus said, his voice firm. I'll make sure they don't. In the days that followed, Marcus worked tirelessly, pulling every string he could. He contacted allies in the legal world, people who had the power and influence to challenge this officer's actions. He knew it was more than just legal action, he was going to need public support, community backing. There would be rallies, protests, and marches. The officer would be held accountable. Marcus and Amara weren't going to let the system sweep this under the rug. Together, they would be the force that dismantled the shield that protected people like the officer who had tried to crush their lives. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about making sure this never happened again. And so the battle began. Not just for Amara's dignity, not just for Marcus' sense of justice, but for every person who had been silenced and mistreated by a system built to protect those in power. This was their fight now. The officer would face the consequences of his actions, but Marcus knew that this fight would echo long after the cameras left, long after the headlines faded. The shield would fall, one piece at a time.